Okay, I've wanted to do this for a while. This is Crusoe's Planet. It's got a veneer of a science fiction, you crashed on a planet, whatever. And that works okay for the basic game. The more advanced games are really more an attempt to make a semi-serious economic model. This is sort of a sandbox for various economic theories, realities, whatever, and try to test them out using what is this basic system that you have involving survivors of a spaceship crash. It could also be survivors on a desert island if you want it, but it's been given the science fiction flavor. This is, I believe, a mostly self-published game. Leptopus Games. This Nigel Ray guy. I think this is the only thing he's done as a game, but I'm not sure. But it's a clever little idea. And, well, let's take a look at what we have. First of all, the components as something that's, not made by a major publisher. They came on regular construction paper, basically. And yes, I used a very dull scissors for them. Some of the sheets were not cut perfectly. That's okay. You have this map which covers a series of different tracks, which you're going to be using kind of a roll and move type pathway through that. Now that's not an important part of the game in a lot of ways, but you'll simply be rolling and moving down this path to collect certain resources, which once you get to market, you can trade with one another in the most basic games, but as things get more complex, you start dealing with a government in place. Now, this game actually represents not just the economics of the situation, but also enforced governments that might be in play with limited effect to change them. You're not going to change the basic economic system that you create or start the game with. Although I suppose one might make that a possibility in some scenarios. It's not covered in the rules. You have a quick start game, which I think is the most basic version, and I'm not even going to deal with this. I'm not sure what I'm going to play yet. You got a big old rule book for the main game, 40 pages, but as you can see, it's fairly big type, kind of reminds me of Junta in terms of the design. Lots of pictures in it, some amusing little parts in it. The storyline running through it, which is the robot Crusoe who thinks he's a pirate, and a minimal story, because I saw the word minimalist on there, that covers things. You also have certain commodities that you can find or create. Actually, you find all of them, even spears on the track, ranging, from basic necessities like water and various, that's leisure, various types of food, substances, spears which can help you obtain resources, as well as they can help you in the fighting aspect of the game. Luxuries, the diamonds, which might acquire some value. These radio parts, or different types of radio items, which you can use to try to effect your rescue. And in fact, you have to get rescued within a certain amount of time for anyone to win at all. Some more eggs lying out here. You have some pawns. The game will hold up to 8 players as designed. However, the designer gives rules for adding more players. So you just need some more pawns, and you're going to need to duplicate some of the commodity pieces. One easy way to duplicate them is these come so that they can be folded in 2, but I'm not going to do that, although there's no great reason not to, mainly because I don't see any advantage the way I play to making little tents out of them. But they could just be cut in half. They'd be less useful there, though, and I'm not planning on playing it with 16 people or some such. You have player aid cards. These also are to be cut in half and used to give you some of the important charts. Little record track, which you're going to keep track of basically what you produce, etc. Wonder what this is. Is this an expansion? Looks like an expansion intended. I don't know if that ever got made. The whole thing I was able to find from an online retailer. I think it ran under $10, like around $5-6 for the base price, but shipping was actually fairly expensive for what comes down to just a folder. I was expecting, maybe $2-3 on shipping, and it's about $10 on shipping from the particular retailer. But given that the price of the game itself was so low, and I was very interested in it, I was willing to go for it because I couldn't find a copy for significantly less than that. All right. So, all those pages there were kind of here's how you should use this rule book, as well as some description of the situation to give flavor, particularly for the basic game. The goal of the game is to gain victory points for maintaining a high quality of life, and that'll be measured in how much you eat, how much leisure you get, and maybe some special commodities that you can pick up. You also, I believe, have to get a radio. You have to get rescued. I'm not sure what. I don't see that in here. So we'll see. All right. The sequence of play. All right. You begin each cycle over here at the crash site. And no, I haven't played it. I haven't looked at it yet. Hello Gregor did a review, or maybe I did long ago. He did a review on it, which may give a better pure overview if that's what you're looking at. I'm going to be looking at the play of the game more, but I want to go through the rules in some detail. I kind of have given the overview largely already. I want to go over the rules in some detail so that you can kind of follow along to some extent with the playthrough, but also so that I know how to play. And for those of you who want me to be doing Thunder at the Crossroads, down here, well, I don't know how long it's going to be before I get to that. I'm hoping to get to it this month. But right now I have some time off from work for a couple of weeks, so I kind of want to do new things rather than something that I already know the rules to. But especially something that's going to take me a long time, and Thunder's going to take a long time. It's going to be a single big pulse of activity. Plus, I've done a lot of CWB recently. I can use a break. Okay, so everybody's going to start over at the crash site, and they randomly get a turn order card, determining which order they're going to be playing in. And then in the play order, each player is going to take a turn. And the turn is basically, okay, if you're sitting at the market already, if you've made it through your path, you get a pink flower. You get to pick flowers. And that's all you do. It's leisure. It's worth some victory points. But it means you're lazing around on your ass, which could be a problem in some situations. If you're not at the market yet, you roll a die and you move that many spaces in the most basic system. If you're on your path, you get to produce something based on the icons that are marked. Now, you may not produce more of something than there are tokens for it in the game. If you land at the market, you're going to be rolling for any experience that you may have gained on the track that you just passed through. Then, after each player takes a turn, as players take their turns, basically each player is going to be continually taking their turns until everybody's down at the market. Once you're at the market, you perform trading. This is in the basic game. Or all kind of governmental activities take place here. Well, no, they actually happen up there. Once everybody's done trading, they all go back here and the government is invoked there. But there may be some mix-up of that in some of the scenarios as to where things go. And then you can choose to use violence as a solution to any problems. After some discussion, then you eat your goods that you may or must eat. You get your victory points. You determine whether you're starving or thirsty or something, or dead. You roll for any unconsumed goods, which will deteriorate over time, much as the shrinkage in After the Holocaust. All your leisure markers disappear, but any radio signals that you have, you get to keep, because they're going to affect the next step, actually. All the radio signal markers are recorded in the common pool, and the markers themselves get returned to the bank. A check's made then to see if the players are rescued. Otherwise, we go back to the start, and people pick the paths they're going to follow based on the rules of the world that they're in. Now, in any space that you land on, you're only able to interact with one type of icon. So, you could take flowers or water or... Oh, no, that's a radio. That's the rocket radio. This is, I think, the military band radio. 3 different bands here. Military radio, citizens band, and top 40 radio. Yeah, I'm going to communicate using top 40. Okay. However, different types of fruit, different varieties of fruit are considered one type of icon. You can collect a bunch of fruit. And basically, you're going to collect as many of the icon you choose to interact with as there are present. So you'd get 3 of these little tentacled fish if you landed here, or a banana. Yeah. This is limited by the tokens in play, and the intention behind that is to simulate the limits on short-term production occurring in nature. Okay, fine. And the depressing effect that large stockpiles have on market. Now remember, this game simulates 2 things. One is, in the very basic game, sort of this natural crash thing. But in other games, it's trying to really be a full economic and social model. So you're no longer playing necessarily an individual person anymore, but maybe a whole class. And there's some interesting factors with that. Now, with speared fish, we should have pictures of speared fish. They look like this. I don't see any right off the bat. There's one over here. Wow, that's a barren area of the track. You only gain a unit if you have a spear, and then you roll a die and you lose your spear on a 1 or a 2. And you'll notice, at least on this track, there is no opportunity to gain spears on it. So you may have to make a deal with, or else travel on your own way beforehand to gather some spears. Spears aren't going to be consumed. You're allowed to hold on to them. They're one of the things that doesn't disappear on you. Oh, all right. The radio signal, you pick. Each frequency is considered its own type. So if you land here, you get 2 of that frequency. But if there's somewhere where it has multiple frequencies, you have to pick which frequency you want to get. I don't know if there's such a space. I don't see one offhand, but the rules cover it. So I'm assuming there is one. If 2 people follow the same path, the path will be overburdened. which reduces the amount of production that they both get on it. For each additional player, well, for one additional player, any space where the player would normally produce 2 or more of a given thing, he produces 1 less. If a path has 3 or more players on it, then each player receives 1 less than the listed amount of the player for each player over 1. Which I think sounds like the same thing. However, production can drop to 0 there. In the 2-player version, if 2 players are on a path, you're going to get something every time you land on an icon. In the if you have 3 or more people, it is possible that you land on an icon and you will get nothing. So people want to take different paths in general. And there will be modifiers for that in the multiplayer. Normally, you're going to roll a die to move down the path, and that's the number of spaces you must move. However, so here the rules are actually not in agreement with the example, but the rules is what I'm going to follow. If you happen to roll a number which you have experience in, you may modify the die roll by adding or subtracting any number up to the number of times you have that number as experience. So in particular, let's say I have the number 2 3 times as experience. If I roll a 2, then I can modify it to a 1, leave it as a 2, move it to 3, 4, or 5, because that's 3 away from the original die roll. When you complete a path, you get a chance to get new experience. You roll a die for each experience number you already have on the path. If you roll any 1s, you get nothing. Otherwise, you gain a new experience number of your choice. Not based on the die roll. You get just pick what number you want. So there might be reasons to double up on a number to give yourself more flexibility when that number's rolled. There might be reasons to spread. It strikes me that there's more reason to spread out. All right. Invoking a government, a player expends a unit of leisure. Remember, this is done at the crash site when you return there. And return it to the bank. This entitles you to begin a round of speeches in which the other players get to participate at no cost. If more than one player wishes to invoke government, then the player who comes in first in the turn order has the first chance to do so. If no player does so, then no speeches are made. If a player has no leisure but wishes, let's just change the pronunciation every now and then, but still wishes to invoke the government, he can do so for free as long as he is indigent. Now, normally you're indigent if you have no water or less than 3 food, but there are scenarios where you get to be indigent without that. Okay. Once a government has been invoked, each player in turn, beginning and ending with the invoker, has the right to make a short speech on why or what it might or might not be desirable to initiate violence, along with any other topics. This is, again, in the basic game. Other games have other aspects to government. Other players may not speak during the period. Each person has their own basic talking stick type situation. Parliamentary questions and hushing people is permitted, however, if they're not allowed to be talking. Once the invoker has given a second speech, you've gone around fully and then the invoker gets another chance, violence can be initiated. This starts from the player after the invoker and continues until all players pass in the same round. When it's your turn to initiate violence, you may either pay a leisure to start a new fight against a single player or join in an existing fight on either side or pass. Passing it around does not preclude other choices in later rounds unless all players pass. However, if you're already involved in a battle, even if you didn't initiate it, you must pass. And when you do a battle, you're going to be rolling a die, basically. And each player gets 1 die, and all the dice on any given side in a battle. Remember, more than one person could be involved in a side in a battle. You can join a battle for free on either side. Whoever gets the highest total roll, that group wins. And the losers will lose half their leisure, and then the winning group has the option to kill the losing group and take all their goods, but not any markers they have, or fine them any and all of their goods. The choice of what to do with losers must be approved by a majority vote of the winners. Now, keep in mind, you're not necessarily trying to beat other people here. And you may need those other people to produce stuff in order to win yourself. So if you kill everyone off, you're on your own on this hostile planet, and that may be more difficult. If you wish, you can discard a spear to add 1 to your die roll, but you have to do this before anybody rolls dice, and you can only do 1 spear. Any player who rolls a natural 3 on their die roll is injured, and they'll spend the next cycle wounded. While wounded, for the entire cycle, they can't use experience, they add 1 to all their movement rolls, and just before trade, they throw away half their leisure, and then they recover from being wounded. However, if they have no leisure, they don't recover, and they continue to be wounded. If you end up fighting while you're wounded, you have -2 to your die roll, but it won't go below 0. If you're entitled to multiple dice for violence, then all dice have to come up as 3s for you to be wounded. At various points, there'll be rules which require voting to select between a number of alternatives. The players must use whatever rules of order they prefer and may divide the question up into subvotes. Each player gets 1 vote unless otherwise indicated. At the beginning of consumption, each player loses victory points, which represent the disadvantages for being on the planet. It depends on the cycle, and this will be on the score sheet. We got a penalty listed for each turn here. You start at 0 victory points in general, and you're not rescued at the end of cycle 9. All players will lose regardless of victory conditions, which is why you need to get the radio working. Water is the most basic survival need. You have to consume a unit of water, otherwise you will be dying of thirst, and you take a -10 victory point penalty. If you consume 2, you get a +1 victory point penalty. You can't consume more than that. With food, likewise, there's a number of -10 spaces, which indicate you're not getting any food really, any significant amount. D is dying, S is starving, which is almost as bad as dying. And H is just hungry, but each of them give you the same -10. Now, food is going to be fish, eggs, and all the fruits. If you consume 3 or more units of food, then you're fed, which means you don't have any penalty except the victory point penalty. You also get a +1 bonus for each different type of food that you eat, which will be listed here. And if you eat no types of food, you get an additional -3. So if you're not fed, you're gonna get more than this -10 in penalties. If you're not fed, and if you were dying of thirst or starvation during the just completed turn, then you die losing. Otherwise, you just lose 10 victory points and suffer the effect of the hunger or starvation listed under privation. Okay, if you don't consume water, you're dying of thirst. You can't gain leisure. You can't gain or use experience. When you're moving, you'll roll 2 dice and take the greater one, and you can only interact with path icons if the result is odd. When engaging in violence, you'll subtract 2 from your die rolls, not going below 0. If you're also not fed, there's no cumulative effect on play. If you consume no food, it's the same as dying of thirst. If you consume only 1 unit of food, you're starving, which is the same, but it won't put you at risk of death if you don't get food next time. If you consume 2 units of food, you're hungry. You can't gain leisure, and you can't gain or use experience. You subtract only 1 from the violence die rolls. If you don't consume both fruit and protein, protein's an egg or a fish, fruit is fruit, you're malnourished, and you will get an additional, you will not gain experience, and you'll be at -1 on any violence. Assuming you don't die, you're going to recover from any penalties that you have there from the prior turn. If you die, any goods you possess are divided by player vote. Well, that depends on the government, though. But yeah. Then each turn you're going to have to roll a die to see whether or not any resources that you kept are preserved. And if you preserve them, you may submit them to market at some later turn when you get there, some later cycle. All right, so hoarding isn't going to work terribly well in this design because all of the materials listed there, which are the foods, are perishable. There's no canned food here. All right. Then phase 6, the rescue phase, I think that's at the end of the turn, at the end of the cycle. You roll a die to see what frequency was being monitored during the current cycle, and then each player rolls a die, adding the dice together. If the sum is less than or equal to the total number of radio signal markers for that frequency that's been produced over the course of the game, then all the surviving players will be rescued, and they have a chance of winning. If you're rescued, you get 3 extra victory points for each diamond that you hold. And then we have some story. Okay. So the introductory scenarios give a few different possible economies to play. So for example, tribal capitalism is one of the easiest, and that's probably what I'm going to try. I may try this again with another type of scenario that's less competitive. But tribal capitalism, you're allowed to trade freely in the market phase, but only one-on-one. Players can basically cut whatever deals they like, but you're not allowed to trade leisure, if I recall correctly. Anyway, you own what you produce, and you can distribute it as you see fit. Tribal socialism throws all the goods into a common pool, and then the players must agree who gets how much. Tribal communism is all goods are pooled, and then they will be, all goods are then going to be evenly distributed among the players, with all odd goods put in a common pile in the center of the table, and then each player in turn, beginning with the first player of the cycle, gets to take an item of his choice from the central pile. So there's no advantage to producing more. However, there are some little quirks in that, and you could say, well, why would you want to play that? Yeah. Okay, the traditional economy is much more complicated. This one sets essentially castes where you're only allowed to travel down one of these different paths, and you have certain obligations based on the path you travel on. For example, let's take a look at this. The grasshopper is allowed to tax each other player except for the firefly, beginning at the bottom of the social rank and working up. For the tax, he takes 1 unit of goods produced that turn by that player, but may not leave the player with 0 water or less than 3 food. So he's got to make sure he's feeding the masses. The grasshopper doesn't have to tax, however. Then he has to provide for the firefly. If the firefly has no water, he must give him one, as long as that doesn't leave the grasshopper without. And if the firefly has less than 3 food, he must bring him up to 3, but again, not leaving himself below 3. If there's no firefly, then you don't have to pay. And then the players may trade with each other. They're able to trade as in tribal capitalism, except each trade can only be with a single type of good for one other single type, and no trade can be made which would be to the disadvantage of the higher ranking of the participants. And then they give the ranking here. And the ranking of goods. So cheap is fish, water, and bananas, moderate, and luxury. When trading goods of the same class, the higher ranked player must receive at least as many as the lower ranked player does in the trade. And when trading two goods of differing classes, the higher ranked player must receive at least twice as many of the lower class good, or the lower ranked player must receive no more than twice as many. If any violence takes place, in addition to the choice between killing and stealing stuff, the winners can force the losers to swap which track they're on. Now remember, your experience, though, is on specific tracks. And I don't know how that's actually... Yeah, I suppose you mark it here. I believe. I don't believe it's just numbers. Let's check that out. No, it looks like it's just numbers. No, he rolls one die for each. No, it's per path. Some things aren't clearly, spelled out in the easiest to consume fashion, but I was pretty sure that it was, yeah, you have experience numbers on any given path that you could be following. Okay. So, those are the options for the basic game. There are a couple of minimalist economies that you can build here. So, for example, the Crusoe's economy is the rugged individualist. You're not allowed to trade with anyone. Ignore overburdening of paths. You'll just be walking along these as if you're on your own little world for each person. The Hobbesian state of nature. You're not permitted to trade, but you're allowed to commit violence, and there's overburdening. These three are considered to be bad choices for most players, for most groups. And then the utopian economy is to be played with one of the tribal economies, but without violence. And this could be either a socialist or capitalist utopia that never has actually existed, but the idea being that if that were possible, you get to look at that model. Now, the advanced rules add some significant changes. I'm not going to play these on the first play, I don't think. I want to give the game a shot without them. But I think this is where the game really starts beginning to look more like a real model of societies and economies, and maybe the more interesting version overall, because the basic comes down to a move and roll with trades going in and some potential for violence, obviously, perhaps. I don't know, maybe I'll do one of these instead. The first is the concept of a money market. Some of the economies are going to require to not just be commodity based, to actually have money in them. And in that case, we have a commodity market subphase, where each good, taken in order of elasticity, and they list them all there, is going to calculate up the number of each type of good currently available from all the production from the current cycle, plus any goods that survived that the current owners wish to put back onto the market. And a commodity price is set at the current money available in that commodity market, divided by the number of units available of that type. Each player puts all of each good that he has into a central pot and takes his share, the commodity price times the number of units contributed in cash. On the first cycle that a given commodity is produced, the money available for that commodity market will be $100. So you'll be getting your share of that $100. If you're the only person to produce it, you get, well, maybe all of it. Depends on how the division works. Then there's a tax subphase. If there are any taxes to be collected, decided by the government, they're collected and paid out in this subphase. At some previous time, each player will have had his tax burden assessed, expressed as an integer. And everybody's going to have to pay some multiple of that integer Basically, the smallest multiple of that integer, which covers all of the government's needs, will be collected. And then that money will be paid out for what it's needed for. Then we hit a wholesale subphase where goods are again taken in order of elasticity. For each good, the players make a secret list of how much they would buy at various prices. So you list the good at how many you want and how much you're willing to pay for it. That's going to be your sort of maximum bid with that. And then prices, we start at some high number that nobody bid that high. And this isn't it. You're secretly recorded already, so it's no big deal. And you count down to the amount which would sell at each price. Players will hold up their fingers to equal the number that they have bid at that price. So if you bid 1 at 15, when 15 is announced, you raise one finger. If you bid 2 at 12, when 12 comes up, you'd raise two fingers. Well, at some point or another, more are in demand than are available. And you back up $1, and everybody gets to buy the amount that they have fingers for at that price from that bid. Okay, so let's say the bid at 12, let's say there are 6 commodities, and the bid at 12 was 4 fingers up, and 3 more fingers go up when the bid goes to 11. Well, the 4 fingers that bid 12 get to buy at 12. If you bid less than that, you get none. Okay. And you're not allowed to discuss this in any sense, because doing otherwise would break the imperfect information in a truly national economy. Remember, we're no longer really dealing with survivors on a planet at this point. Then we go to a retail subphase where players can trade with one another using simple barter, but with a limitation. Players can only trade with the players to either side of them in turn order. The first and last players also being permitted to trade, to again represent limited information about the market and transportation costs and the like. And we have different kinds of governments determined here. One of the simplest, the Athenian democracy, all decisions are made with each player having one vote. A dictatorship, one player is going to be selected to be the dictator. Whenever the government makes a decision, the dictator makes it. Players can speak while the dictator is deciding if they have his permission. The dictator doesn't have to pay leisure to invoke government or initiate violence. And then there's different kinds of dictatorships, whether they're stable or unstable or fanatic. A stable one, the dictator has a number of dice in battle equal to the number of other players in the game. So he has pretty much an equal chance of putting down a rebellion against him by everyone. An unstable one, the dictator has any number of dice less than the number of other players, but at least has one. And fanatical, the dictator is absolute. He cannot lose any battle. He can always inflict losses on his enemy. Starting to sound kind of weird, like, wow, this doesn't sound like a game. It's not meant to only be a game. There's a game here, but it's also meant to represent something to investigate these models. A representative democracy is just like a dictatorship, except the dictator is a president who stands for election once per cycle. The bureaucracy, by majority vote, the players make all decisions that the government will have to make during the game at the beginning of the game, and they write a flow chart. And they kind of did this here, but without the diagram, as to how the government is going to make decisions. So, for example, it could decide to, they give the example here. Each turn reward for each radio signal is set at $30 minus the number of such signals already in the pool. So there's an algorithm in place to determine how much those are going to pay out, etc. And this is all voted by a majority vote at the beginning. At the beginning of each cycle, as soon as play order is determined, the first player may suggest an amendment to one box of the flow chart. And if it receives a unanimous vote, it passes and the game changes a little bit. During play, it might be the case that a government decision is required, but there's no way to interpret the flowchart. And in that case, the first player has to decide what occurs, and then the flowchart has been changed by that player's decision without any vote by anyone else. Then there's constitutional hybrid, which indicates, hey, you allocate different parts of the government to different people. So, there might be a dictatorship over the violence aspect, but, or a representative democracy, but some sort of bureaucracy to handle the taxation, so that can't be changed by the dictator directly. And that way you can model more complex societies like the United States, which kind of has that kind of mix between a representative democracy and a bureaucracy. However, there is some voting power there that's also represented in the creation of laws. So you might have to tweak it more than need be. There are tack-on modules, which can also be added from the advanced scenarios. And then they have specific scenarios here which cover different types of economies that they set up. State capitalism is basically fascism, or they call it, they use the National Socialism here, where players control the production. It's yet the actual decisions made are made by the government, I believe, there. Oh no, specific players are the only ones allowed to sell given goods, but they're allowed to choose how they produce them themselves. Market socialism, the government sets wages for each item to be paid at the beginning of the cycle, and a limit how many units of a good can be purchased by a given player. Government socialism, where the government actually determines, I think, who gets what. Yeah, the government decides how to distribute all the goods produced. Centralized communism, everything's dumped into the pot, everybody gets $100, and then they can buy stuff using the market to purchase things. Just some weird options there. We have a landlord module, which says particular players own these tracts and lease them out to other players. And again, this is all kind of decided at the beginning of the game, although there's some possibility for movement in them. Corporations, the paths end up being corporate controlled, which actually means the experience in them is per corporation. But the production is presumably made by the players. However, the players are limited to how much they can produce, and the corporation takes the rest. Guild oligarchy, players are limited to what they're allowed to produce. They can't produce anything that's not accepted by, their initial free draw. Government gets to assign people to the paths they choose in the paternalistic economy. Third world country ends up, I didn't really read this one too carefully. There's a limit to how much can be produced of each resource. One player is the agent of multinational corporations. There's some really interesting things. Then there's discrimination modules, one that does race, creating hostilities between certain races and disadvantages for certain races, which will be allocated among the players. So like one player might be the minority race. And if you are prejudiced against a race, You lose 1 victory point for each target of your prejudice who gets as much or more of what you want than you do. And these can be set up as different relationships at the beginning of the game if you want to model something specific. Gender, they go through a whole rule doing essentially the same thing with women as the race thing. Well, not quite. Half the players, women will have their die rolls rounding down when engaging in violence. But there are other possible rules there other than this basic disempowerment, which says you won't be able to enforce your will through violence. Women are prohibited from certain paths, perhaps, and maybe there's one or two paths that men are prohibited from as well. No suffrage, give women no right to vote or invoke government, and no right to speak if government is invoked. The dollhouse variant, each woman must have a husband, and he collects the goods she produces and she doesn't participate in the market. During consumption, he may feed and water her and is obligated to see she has 3 units of food and 1 of water before he consumes any of his own. Matriarchal golden age, which kind of reverses the situation there to some extent. Maybe a little differently. You can give disabilities where players can't go gain certain icons. Then there's some kind of interesting ones to me. So early feudalism, I got the idea of this one, and I might do this instead. If employed, okay. So there'll be a feudal warlord who becomes an independent military force. At the beginning of the game, 1 player is selected at random to be the warlord. The warlord can be strong or weak. In either case, the warlord doesn't pay leisure to invoke government or initiate violence. A strong warlord wins all battles. A weak warlord has some number of dice up to the number of players in the game, and he can be wounded normally. If the warlord loses the fight, the winning side must elect a new warlord who will have 1 less die in combat than the previous warlord. So slowly, the feudalism will disperse there. It doesn't really cover what the effects of giving all the means of coercion into 1 player's hands will be. So feudalism need not be a non-benevolent situation, just like with dictatorship. There's an option for the church, which can limit or prohibit violence. Libertarianism. Let's see what we have for this. Players can form contracts which they write down as an aid to memory. Limits are made on the initiation of violence. Government may be invoked normally, but rather than a round of speeches, players have an open debate. At the conclusion of the debate, the players should know which players have violated written contracts since the last government phase, with ambiguous contracts settled by a vote of non-contracting parties. Players may only initiate violence against players in default, but when joining in, players may join in on any side. If the losers of a fight do not include any defaulting persons, they may not be punished except by the confiscation of diamonds and spears. If there's a monetary market, no taxes will be collected, and instead players must develop contracts to see that whatever the taxes would normally pay for gets done, if they want it done. An objectivist model, which 1 player gets to be John Galt, and any goods produced go to him. If he produces a unit of leisure, then no one can produce anything whatsoever until his next turn. And when Galt finishes his path, everyone else immediately moves to the market. Only John Galt gains experience, but everyone else gets to use it. And that experience is not path specific. If Galt dies, then all players lose. Rules for more than 8 players. Optional victory conditions. So these are kind of neat. Some different ways to tinker with the victory. let's see. One alternative is that players choose secretly whether they're altruistic, self-interested, or cutthroat. Self-interest would be the normal game. Altruistic get the average of their score and the scores of the two worst off players other than themselves. And cutthroat gets the difference between their scores and the median for the group. So cutthroat would be actually trying to keep the median low. That might be very hard to do. And in fact, it strikes me that anything but self-interest is probably not going to have a good chance, but I'm not sure. I haven't thought about it too hard. Different values for the diamonds, which could be random. Some players might look at signs of luxury as more important. So each diamond is equal to the number of players who have less diamonds than that player. Small boat, you need diamonds in order to even survive the game because the rescue ship doesn't have as many seats. So whoever has the most diamonds is able to trade them in for a guaranteed seat, and the people with the least diamonds don't get to get on the ship and die. Some alternate punishments for losers of battles, like crippling someone, you get to give them the crippled value. Enslaving them, you get to put them on the track, and you gain whatever they gain. Exiles, this is really complicated. You essentially start off a new game over somewhere else. And then there's a random scenario generator. All in all, I'm curious how it's going to work. It wasn't quite what I had hoped for. I had hoped for something that was, I don't know, more generically defined rather than such a sandbox type thing. But I have been curious to see how it would work out, and I want to play with it a little bit. So I think it's time to do this. And I'll send this up.